And I mean, that's the story of human beings, you know. You're in a place that's working out pretty well, something happens to knock you off your perch, you're down in the chaos for a good amount of time, and maybe you never get out. But maybe you learn something down there, maybe you strengthen your character, then you pop up to a new place, and maybe it's better. Better aim, better you. Now, I'm not being overly optimistic about this. I know perfectly well that people encounter impediments during their life that they find almost impossible to recover from, but it's the best shot you have. So anyways, Jonah runs away, but God isn't very happy about that because it's actually Jonah's destiny. It's necessary for Jonah to repair the city. So God sends a storm, and you know, the waves are high, and I think what that means is because the water is often a symbol for the unconscious, and that's because things lurk down there in the water and that you can pull up that are useful. Monstrous things that you can pull up that are useful. You can fish for them. You can go fishing in your own being for answers, which is what you do when you try to think, right? You ask yourself a question and you wait, and maybe an answer appears. It's like, where did that come from? You didn't know what the answer was before it appeared. Would it just pop into being out of nowhere? Who knows? So you fish. So anyways, the waves come and the boat's going to be knocked over, and that's what happens, I think, when you know you should do something. I mean, everyone has this experience, I believe. Perhaps you would be willing to put up your hands if this experience is foreign to you. Okay? There's part of you telling you you should do something, and it's hard to do it, effortful, and maybe you're afraid of it, and so you don't do it. You just procrastinate, right? And so how do you feel about that? Good? I mean, so what, you feel that you're betraying yourself. Your anxiety actually gets worse, not better, even though, you know, you can put it off moment to moment, but that doesn't help because every time you put it off, the anxiety just grows a little bit. You're not proud of yourself. You have a sense that you're making things more chaotic than they should be. You know, and if you do that long enough, and I'm sure many of you have had that experience, if you do that long enough, if that becomes habitual, things will get so stormy around you that you'll fall right into the chaos, into the watery chaos, and maybe you'll drown. So it's not a very good idea to run from your destiny, let's say. Whatever that might be. And you need a destiny, you need a place to aim at because that's what gives your life meaning. And you need meaning in your life because life is hard. So, you know, you need something to buttress yourself against that. So anyways, they wake Jonah up, and Jonah says, it's probably my fault because, like, I'm running away from something I'm supposed to do, and, you know, God isn't very happy about that, so why don't you just throw me overboard? And the crew isn't very happy about that, but the waves are really starting to come up, and Jonah's pretty insistent that he's the cause of the problem, and so they draw lots, and Jonah is chosen, and so they decide to toss him into the ocean, and immediately everything's calm. So he's a center of chaos because he's not doing what he's supposed to do. Fine. Well, then a whale comes up and swallows him, and then he's in the whale for 3 days. Now, that's a weird thing. The whale, that's the whale that Geppetto's in. That's a dragon. It's that thing that you have to go out there and conquer to get something of value. Now, when you've made an error, when you've fallen off the pathway, when you've deviated from what you know you should do, it produces a state of internal chaos and worry and concern. You're thrust into the unknown. You're thrust into unknown territory and chaos. You don't know what to do. And that's often symbolized by the encounter with a monster, like a dragon, or something that lives under the water. And I think the reason for that is, as far as I've been able to tell, is that human beings, because we've been prey animals for forever, in our battle with carnivorous lizards, for example, and alligators, and even dinosaurs, because there were dinosaurs around at the time of our most distant ancestors. And there was even a cat at one point that was adapted with teeth to pierce human skulls. So it had a head that was exactly shaped to grab you here and put a tooth through the back of your skull. So like we've come through some rough times, man, and we have a system in our mind that's a threat predator detection system. That's the thing that makes little kids think about monsters in the dark, right? Because, well, there is monsters in the dark. Parents always say, well, there's no monsters in the dark. It's like, that's not true. The dark is full of monsters. There might not be any in your room right at that moment, but that doesn't mean there aren't monsters in the dark. And crimes take place, like criminals don't get up at 6 in the morning and like, you know, have breakfast and go rob a bank. They do that sort of thing at night. People do the things that are fit for the night in the night. And lots of predators are nocturnal. And you can't see very well in the dark. And kids aren't stupid, you know. They've evolved to stay pretty damn close to the fire. Because the kids that wandered away from the fire got picked off by hyenas and lions and, you know, crocodiles and whatever else the hell was out there to eat the unwary. So, the circuit that we use to defend ourselves against predators, as we've evolved cortically, that circuit has come to represent what we don't know in general. Because the predators, of course, inhabit where we don't know. And so, evolution is a conservative force, and we use the circuits that we've evolved to represent new things. And so, the unknown, the chaos, is often represented by a monster that swallows you up and pulls you down. And you know, when you're feeling terrible, you don't say, well, I'm feeling up. You say, I'm feeling down. Well, why is that? Well, down is worse. I guess you're flat on the ground when you're down, or you're in a hole or something like that. You're hiding in a hole. You know, it's down. And you're threatened by something. You know, maybe you're threatened by your own inadequacy. That might be part of it. Maybe that's partly what you imagine as a monstrous force, because, you know, your proclivity towards procrastination and your weakness of character is part and parcel of why you happen to be in the underworld. And that's the underworld, the mythological underworld. That's where you go when things fall apart. And if you understand that, if you know that that's what that means, then you have one of the keys that opens up ancient stories to you, and you understand things. Your life can be organized and going very well, and then something comes up, and poof, everything changes. Some axiom that you were living by, and it might be the existence of a partner, it might be a job, it might be your health, any of those things, gone. And you go somewhere when that happens. You go somewhere. It's a state of being. You're still in the same world, but it's not the same at all anymore. Everything about it is different. It's all negative and dark, and you don't know what to do. You're confused. And so, what do you do down there in the underworld when things have fallen apart, especially if it's the worst possible case scenario and you realize that you actually had something to do with your demise? That's really annoying, you know, when something bad happens to you, and then, you know, you grind yourself into bits trying to figure out what the hell happened, and then you realize that, well, you were playing a causal role. Now, sometimes you're so depressed you assume you're playing a causal role, and you weren't. It's not easy to figure out by any stretch of the imagination, and it isn't that everyone who does something terrible is at fault for it, but sometimes you find that you were off the path somehow, and maybe even that you knew it and that you didn't attend to it, and that's why all of this hit the fan. And so then down there in that chaos, you decide that you're going to do what you're supposed to do instead. And then maybe you get to rise up again, renewed, if you're lucky, and then you can go fix the city. And that's what this story's about. And that's why I picked the image to represent the course, because really what happens, you see, with the psychoanalysts, the road to health, if you're not doing well, which means that as you act in the world you're not getting what you want, there's something wrong with the match between your presuppositions and your actions, habitual, and the way the world is responding to you. And so it's not turning out for you. And the question is, well, what can you do about that? And one answer might be to examine yourself for presuppositions and action patterns that are not serving you well, and to find out what they are and what to do about them. And maybe some of that is, maybe you're not moving forward because of fear, and maybe that fear is grounded in terrible experiences that you had in the past that you've never been able to understand. And maybe one of the ways of gluing yourself back together and expanding your personality so that you could in fact live properly in the world is to go back to those terrible events and untie them and straighten them out and understand them and drop them. And that's what psychotherapy is about in large part. Psychoanalytic, behavioral, doesn't matter. What are you afraid of? What are you avoiding? What are you failing to develop? Maybe from fear, maybe from avoidance, God only knows, maybe from disgust. How can you get over it? How can you reclaim those parts of yourself? I said in the first lecture that I was going to try to provide you with a schema into which you could place the theorists that we're going to discuss. And it requires going down deep to do that. And there are presuppositions. My presupposition, and this is a psychoanalytic presupposition, it's predicated on a poetic tradition, I would say, on an ancient tradition. I learned most of it from reading Jung. It was Carl Jung that helped me understand that we're nested inside a dream, that we have to be, because we don't know everything. We have to take things as givens, and the things that we take as givens are nested inside stories, and we accept the stories as valid, and then outside the stories is the absolute unknown. You know, and that's partly, the stories are tricky, you know. One of the classic stories, it's a variant of the Jonah story, I would say, is St. George and the Dragon. And that story was represented during the Renaissance and during medieval times. Thousands and thousands of ways. It's like the story of St. Patrick who chased the snakes out of Ireland. Same idea. And the typical St. George story is The Hobbit or Harry Potter. So in the second volume of Harry Potter, correct me if I have any of these details wrong, you remember there's that snake, the basilisk. So there's this magic castle, right? You guys have no problem with that. Magic castle, no problem. There's an orphan, he's an orphan, he goes to the magic castle to learn how to be more than normal, right? The Muggles, he has a Muggle family. We're not too happy with the Muggle family. Like, as representatives of normal people, they have some lacks. Now, of course, the reason for that is that, well, that's what teenagers often feel about their parents, right? They feel, Jesus, these couldn't really be my parents. I must have some other parents who are like together. And those are like magical parents, right? Parents that live in the sky. And of course, Harry Potter has earthly parents. That's the Muggles. And Dursley, I think, is the kid. He's a wonderful piece of work. And you know, ill-formed, eh? Spoiled, ill-formed, selfish, very far from the ideal. He's a foil for Harry. And of course he's appreciated and doted on, and Harry is actually punished for his virtues. Well, that's a classic story, right? To be punished for your virtues. I mean, if you look at the story, the central story in Christianity, the central story in Christianity is about someone who is precisely punished in the worst possible way for the highest possible virtues. And that's what it makes it an archetypal story, because there isn't anything more unfair than that. And so it's a limit, in a sense. It can't be worse than that. Being punished for being, you know, unworthy, it's like, yeah, well, at least makes sense. But to be punished because you have your act together and you're a good person, that's real punishment. And that's what happens to Harry. So luckily he finds out that he's magical, which is quite convenient, and off he goes to wizarding school. And you know, that's actually like going and studying the humanities. I mean, it was when they still were, you know, because it's through the humanities that you that you make contact with the magic of your culture, and that makes you more than merely the child of your parents, because you are more than merely the child of your parents. You're the child of nature, and you're the child of culture. And until you understand what that means, understand that you have two sets of parents, like the divine hero always has two sets of parents, you can't construe yourself properly as an individual. You're not situated properly in the world. You don't know what your responsibilities are. You can't orient your values properly, and you will suffer for that, because as far as I can tell, because life is so difficult, you have to do something that's truly worthwhile in order to justify it. And so, well, and that's what all these stories tell you. That's what the story of Jonah is telling you. It's like you have an ethical duty to straighten things up, and if you don't do it, you're going to be sorry. And that story is echoed everywhere. Well, now St. George, well, let's go to Harry Potter. That's what we were talking about. So he goes off to the magic castle, and